Okay. Before I go talk about NUXT, right? Because from the previous view meetup, one of the common question is how do you do authentication with Vue? So originally I wanted to merge this in together as one talk, but apparently it seems that it's better if I separated it. So I'll just quickly run through this. General question on how do you do authentication with Vue is you don't. You're thinking it wrong if you're thinking that your front end can do authentication. Vue at the end of the day is just a view of your back end. So API should handle its own state and login session, not Vue. Vue should respond to the API success or failure. That's the general rule of thumb. But the thing is, I do understand where the questions come from, especially from the student groups who's trying to get their project started on Vue. So I'm going to give you a few pointers. Quick crash course. Use properly established APIs for authentication, preferably one with a JS front-end library, because especially if you're a student, unless you're going to spend at least a month on learning how to build a login API security, you're probably going to get hacked. So yeah, don't bother. So here's a few examples. Auth0. So Auth0 is probably the easiest one. They even have a free tier. Effectively, all you need to do is call a command, web auth pop up the authorized. It will create a pop-up on your screen, and then let's say if you select connection Twitter, it will do Twitter for you, and then from then onwards you just need to do this check. So if it's logged in, yeah, you can do some functionality inside there. Auth0 is great when, in particular, when let's say you're doing application, for example, like the to-do list, where you don't actually need an API backend. It's also great if, let's say, for more complex use cases, you want your users to be able to communicate to, let's say, Google Cloud or AWS without a server in between. Auth0 can allow you to authenticate them to access certain files, certain databases, and that's called delegation. So this is purely for those who want to do the pure serverless, all the way on the AWS and Google Cloud thingy. That's what Auth0 is for, if you want to use that. Another common one, which I think he's going to probably cover, so I'm probably overlapping, is Firebase. Firebase, if you use this library, Firebase UI-web, it's same thing. You have a convenient to use command where it just pops up the UI, the person key in the details, done. From then onwards, you just need to have a single function call to actually check whether, or an event instance to check whether the user is logged in or not. Then you do whatever you want. Same thing, let the API do the authentication for you. Don't authenticate on your browser. Lastly, for those who, one of the last few is for those who want to write their own APIs. Once again, don't write your own authentication library unless you know what you're doing. If you're a student, that means it's no. So use passport for JS, request.login. So this is where you set the authentication call for let's say /login. And once you're in there, right, whatever API backend you have, right, you can just use passport.authenticate. So local means you are authenticating to a local database. The passport documentation has Facebook, Google, whatever, Twitter, GitHub you want. Then from there on, you just function request that user. The default behavior, right, is that they will only allow this function to be executed, right, if it's logged in. So by default, it actually returns a 401. You can change that so that you can have more customized behavior, but double check the passport docs. Yeah, once again, API should handle its own state and login sessions and not Vue. Okay. And at the end of the day, for some gotchas, if you are having a separate API server from Vue, so let's say if you have Vue on URL one, let's say localhost, and your API is api.myspecialserver somewhere, take note that at the end of the day, you just use cookies. It works. I don't think anyone here is working with a bank that insists you don't use cookies. That'll be harsh. I've done that before. Note that HTTP auth, if you're planning to use HTTP auth, is slowly being phased out. So while it may work for you, don't be surprised if it doesn't work eventually, even with HTTPS. And the gotcha is when there's two separate servers, take note your browser by default or your server by default will reject the connection. This is called cross-origin resource sharing. If you're planning on deployment, right, for all of them to be on the same domain, you do not need to worry about it. So for development, you either add a whitelist, because your API server needs to be able to accept the API call from, let's say, localhost. You can set the parameter in there. This is respective to your API server, so go check the documentation for that. Alternatively, disable calls on your browser. If you ever do this, please use a development browser. Like in Chrome, you can set a new profile. Never use this for your personal account, if not your Facebook account will be hacked very quickly. So yeah, that's a quick crash course on how to do auth on Vue. Okay, now to my actual topic. API driven development with NUXT. I'll be coming from a perspective more of a tech lead and a slash CTO rather than a developer, because the thing is, one of my major concerns is how do we get new developers on board to Vue, what's the difficulty they face, and how we make it easier for them. And for those who actually have experience with Vue, how many of you have been through Webpack hell? Yeah, there are a few of them. Yeah, basically, Vue on its own is just bare bones. In order to get most of the wonderful functionalities you hear, right, you need to configure Webpack or use a pre-configured Webpack. And for many people, configuring this thing is like voodoo magic. And frankly speaking, only in our company, there's only one person fully qualified to properly do Webpack, and that's my CEO, co-founder, which is filming me right now. Other than that, even I find it kind of confusing at times for certain modules because every single module you install may have its own instruction sets and guidelines. So to get around it, we use NUXT because I don't have too many CEOs around to help me debug Webpack. So NUXT is what NUXT is for those who use Vue. A common what they observe is commonly used for Webpack, all pre-baked into one giant Webpack template. So yeah, quick run through of who I am. I'm Eugene. I go by the username Pico Creator in various places like Stack Overflow, GitHub. I co-founded UIDishes, which is a web test automation platform. So if you create a website and you want to test it, you can use us. We have a free tier. I also run a web dev house, Picoder. And the interesting thing about me is I'm also one of the co-creators of GPU.js. So if you want to run JavaScript on GPU, you can look it up. I'm not talking about this though. Okay. So Vue is, in summary, from a DevOps and CTO's point of view, Vue is great because it's flexible. Especially for those who are using legacy-based apps, it provides you a route of migration to a new framework. You are not forced like React to do an all or nothing approach. You can slowly put Vue like in 5 pages and slowly upgrade everything part by part. The other thing is object binding. This is very hard to explain on how useful this is. In general, because of the way if you use Vue, you start binding your data object to the input fields. So all of a sudden, right, a lot of cases where you do that, where last time in jQuery, you do on change update this, suddenly it's binded to the object itself, and you do not need to worry about it in most cases. This reduced a lot of the code from what I observed from legacy apps that we migrated over, because there was so many on change events that was basically obsoleted with Vue. Modular components. This is probably a standard as of now for all the major frameworks, be it React, Angular, and Vue, is that you get to reuse components. The bad things, especially for those who are getting used to Vue, it's bare bones, I already mentioned, and Webpack can kind of get magical. There are quite a fair bit of small gotchas, which I will point out, especially. One is reactivity in depth. Reactivity in depth. So because the thing is, I'm assuming most of you, if they are not familiar with Vue, when you do data binding, you'll be, let's say, binding to an object. So let's say your input field, you call it, let's say, email. You bind to the object called email with a variable email there. When you make a change on the object, you expect it to update on your UI. When you make a change on the UI, you expect it to update on the object. That works as planned until one of it was null. When one of it was null, right, and a few other edge cases, right, the Vue will never attach the event listener to detect these changes. So reactivity in depth, right, is an entire documentation to cover all these edge cases. For junior developers who seriously want to work on Vue in production, it is very well recommended to search up on it and read it. The other small gotchas that we face so far in our development cycle is creating custom inputs can be confusing. I will show a link to a tutorial that helps later, but in general, it's not as straightforward as it was in HTML and JS. Lastly, for all of you who loves to build your front end and then use a preprocessor language like, let's say, PHP or some templating engine that outputs the final HTML and use some secure or config parameters inside there, yeah, basically don't do that anymore, because anything you put inside as a configuration or a JavaScript inside Vue is pretty much going to be on the internet, and if you put private keys in there, Good luck to you. Okay, so NUXT, making view less ones. So like what I said, NUXT does this by taking all the commonly observed Webpack modules that most people use and basically put it together. NUXT can get kind of magical because it builds on top of Webpack, and that's the whole point of it. A few things to note. NUXT is NUXT chunking. So okay, so I think before that I will so few things to note for NUXT. So in NUXT itself, right? This is from the NUXT guide itself. It just like all other view templates, you can initialize it respectively. So view initialize NUXT community starter template, create a project name. After you initialize it, right? As per normal, you do your npm installation. From then on, you just do your npm run dev. That is how out of the box is supposed to be. From then on, you get this package already does hot reloading for you. Meaning, every change you make and you view it at port 3000, you see the changes immediately. Okay, that's in concept lah. But if you have too many things in your project, sometimes you need to wait 5 minutes. But it's getting there. So, and from then onwards, that's how you start building your projects. I think I'll skip this. So when you what NUXT give you, right, is a template where for you to build on either SPA, single page application with Express. This is also useful if you're in the sense that if you're also trying to do a PWA, because you can do a SPA export. At the same time, you can with Express build your own API. At the same time, it allows you to do what is called a universal web application export, where you bring your own API and effectively NUXT is purely just will output purely HTML, JS, and CSS, nothing else. And that is what I'm going to focus on. So how NUXT works, right, is that inside the template, you will see multiple folders after you do the generate the NUXT project. You will see the assets folder, the components folder, the layout folder, the pages folder, and the static folder. These are usually the common folders most people will need or I needed. There is additional folders for more complicated behavior like overriding Webpack, which is mainly plugin middleware, and for store is for the storage backend, local storage. I'm not covering these three. I'll be mainly covering this here above. What happens is once all these source files, right, will then out when you do NUXT generate, is a command as well. You will for doing the universal web application, it will output into minified HTML. It will inside the NUXT folder, it will minify your CSS, and JavaScript. It will optimize your image. So for those of you who has been cropping your images manually and adjusting the resolution, yeah, it actually does that for you. It makes it easier. It will optimize it for CDN as well, make it compatible with caching, and lastly, it will also support static assets. I will go through more of this later. Okay, that was the installation just now. So, how NUXT work, right? Yes?
Yeah. Question. How big is, firstly, do you use it in production?
Yes.
Secondly, how big is this?
How big is what?
A distribution folder.
Do your NUXT generate?
It's actually heavily dependent on
What you import. For
Yeah,
example,
because
if
it's
you
just a
import
Webpack
Bootstrap, then it's huge.
You use it in production?
in our production. I think it's around 4 meg, but I admit there's a lot of things that can be cut now.
So is it on S3 or?
Yeah.
Okay.
We just bump it all the S3. So this is literally an example production code, though I wish it could be better. What happens is actually for NUXT, right? For anything inside pages folder, right, where the view components you put there automatically gets generated as pages. So in this case, for example, inside the pages folder, I have a login.view. And this is some code for it, blah, blah, as the component. What happens is that when you do the export, right, into the distribution folder, it can get into quite a scary minified HTML. This effectively is effectively a SPA on its own, but that's what it does for every single page. From then onwards, and one of the good things is that again, I said the image got hashed, it got optimized. So naturally, if let's say you import a file that got optimized, it will need to refer to the correct file path. So this tilde prefix, right, is what triggers the linkage to the optimized files. And the same thing happens for components. So if you were to look into the export NUXT folder, right, very rarely will you see, let's say, a login form.view, for example, for your component. It will probably be compressed and chunked together with, let's say, 30 other components into one giant file for optimization purposes. So that brings me to why we use NUXT, because NUXT, what it encourages is actually a very API-driven development cycle for us, and that is what benefits us mainly, because if by you doing a universal web application export early on, right, instead of using Express, right, it forces you to separate your API from your UI, effectively bring your own API. This was a follow-up from the previous. Once again, API should handle all login and state management. And in that process, right, you can actually independently develop your UI or your API backend separately. Any developer, if let's say for a bigger team, if they want to make a change on the front end, they just need to make a change on NUXT. They can easily push changes to S3. S3, you can easily push changes to multiple domains or multiple subdirectory. S3 is cheap anyway. And for API backend, because your API can just focus on purely the backend work, yeah, you can just optimize it in that direction. Yes?
How do you handle your versioning for, like, as in, for you guys? How do you handle your
For front end or back end?
Because you all use static, right?
Yeah, so are you referring to front end or back end?
Front end.
Okay, so for us front end, right, there are two major, each developer, right, the developers have access to their own dedicated domains / deployment path. So for that we don't actually optimize for the static handling, because it's meant for them to push as fast as they want all their changes. Once things get merged into H branch, what we do, the H branch, and then eventually the staging and production branch. In those cases, we just push the files as it is to S3. The thing is what we do is that in Jenkins, we are using Jenkins as of now. In Jenkins, right, when we take all these packages, right, we effectively take the past 3 packages and upload the whole thing, and then we clear out all the remaining files. That way, unless you're doing 3 major production pushes in quick succession, right, your assets shouldn't face any of those timeout issues, because it's supposed to be a gradual migration from there. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. I think I kind of accidentally covered a few points. They say separation of API and UI development. One thing useful is that by focusing on UI first, one team can focus on UI first, right? They can mock the entire API, and especially if you develop your API with a JavaScript library in mind, they could just effectively fake all the data first before they link it to your API. Then once again, also with proper API versioning, which is another topic altogether from NUXT. With proper API versioning, it's also easier for every developer to make any changes on API. I already mentioned with NUXT and Vue, you can do pure static, you can do CDN, you can basically get fast performance and enjoy it. And ultimately, right, for most of the junior developers, they never need to touch Webpack. That's probably the most important of it all. That's Webpack complexity hidden from the junior developer, because like I said, I only got one CEO to work with. And yeah, so things like I mentioned in the gotchas, there is one huge major gotcha in NUXT. This is less important for students and more important for a business point of view, because chunking is now mandatory in production along with minification. Chunking and minification is great and I like it, except that it can fail in production, and when that happens, effectively you have no way to debug it other than hopefully the bug appears in staging as well, and slowly push changes, try and repeat again and again. It's a painful thing, but I wish they could switch it off. I actually tried to modify the code to switch off chunking and minification for the HTML distribution build. Unfortunately, it's hard-coded in so many places, I couldn't get it to work. So if you need someone in the worst case scenario to be experienced in know how to debug these worst case scenarios. So far, we only had one incident of it in 4 months, so your mileage may vary. The other thing is, and this is not a NUXT specific thing, this is for any view/webpack to a build file, distribution file. It can't support dynamic path. So for example, if let's say you want to do a project under, let's say, awesomewebsite.com or mocha.com/special client A/special client B, dynamically generated client path for every client. As Webpack and NUXT requires an absolute path, you can't actually use relative path within NUXT itself. The workaround that I did was that inside your CI and CD, I actually pre-built the package with a reserved keyword. So this is like custom secret subpath. In your backend for every so when you need to generate, let's say, a client specific deployment in, let's say, your website.com/special client A, you basically copy and paste all the files and you do a massive search and replace for those keywords. Just make sure your keyword is unique and it doesn't mess anything up. The thing is NUXT in trying to make things easier for the junior developers is that in general, adjusting, it's all about all your templates are all within the body element, HTML body element. If you want to adjust anything outside the body element, you will need to study out the NUXT configuration guide. So depending on your requirements, so most people probably can get away without modifying things outside the body element. But if you want to do things like progressive web app, I probably want to give this a try because you need to modify things inside the header element from what I saw just now. And this is what I mentioned about the links, about the small gotchas. For Vue, there's a guide on reactivity in there, highly suggested to read for anyone who's new. And also for creating a custom input, there's a good Lara class tutorial on it. Seeing from experience over time in trying to train up the team, this is pretty much like one of the few mandatory reading beyond the how to start Vue guide. And once again, don't put your secure private files on your HTML. Yep. Thank you.